Morning. How we doing, record collectors and record collecting land? I hope you're all having a good month of December. We all know it's been a crazy year this year, but people are still finding records and buying records, and in some way records seem like they're here to stay. As I started collecting records in the 90s, as everyone was getting rid of their vinyl, I didn't really anticipate 20 years later they'd still be part of the marketplace. It's a pretty amazing story, and not much survives the advance of technology. The cassette, the compact disc, digital, all that stuff, downloading, streaming, it's all moved the technology forward. But vinyl just seems to have this connection with its audience, and it's not just nostalgia. Because I'll be honest, I had some vinyl as a kid, more Christian contemporary garbage like that, and when I became a teenager, it was cassettes that I was buying. So when I started buying vinyl after my CD collection got stolen in 1990, vinyl wasn't nostalgic for me. I had been getting into classic rock at that time, and so buying that stuff on classic rock that had been stolen from me off CD on vinyl seemed like it made sense. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. It's a good way to get all the Stones old records, and Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, was buying the vinyl format, and it just kind of grew into a love affair for me. But I certainly didn't think that it would stay, because if you go into a record store in 1993, 94, there's nothing new being printed. It's really non-existent, really through the early mid-90s. The numbers just drop off. And for those of you who don't believe me, search for vinyl copies of albums from 1993, 92. See how much you can find and what they cost. Things like Neil Young Unplugged can be over $100 easily, just because the numbers were so limited, and even what is out there didn't come out until a decade later. It's just a tough time for vinyl collectors, but it's cool to see that it's become such a niche but important part of the industry now. And for most people who want a hard copy of an album, that's the format they're going to go with. And it's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. Let's dive in now into, this is curling up and it's bugging me here. Anyway, let's dive into part 2 of my Savoy series. We did 12 records I love from Savoy the other day. They were the obvious choices. They're the ones that most people are going to be collecting first, and the ones that have been reissued in Japan, and the demand is there for those records. They're all fairly obvious choices. These are a little bit less so. However, one of my stipulations for this list, both front and back sides of it, was that I didn't want to look through my list, my discography books, and go, oh yeah, that one. I wanted to see what popped into my mind. Which ones did I remember? Which ones jumped out at me? And usually that's from how much I listened to it. Sometimes even a cover. There's things that can make a record really jump out. But for the most part, these are records I do love and listen to frequently, which is how they got on these lists. So you're going to have seen some of these before, of course, but that's just the nature of this beast. So starting with, we're going to do these in sequential order, 12027. So number 27 in the 12,000 series. Actually 28 because there is a 12,000. But Jimmy Scott, Very Truly Yours. And just a great old vintage album cover showing the young man with his wonderful contralto voice, I think it's called. He's just so young and tender there. I just got redone watching Twin Peaks and Fire Walk With Me, where of course he does a couple tracks in there, Sycamore Trees. David Lynch brought him back, which kind of brought Jimmy Scott back to the club circuit actually. So kudos to David Lynch for that. But his voice is so unique. I feel like I could be gone from this planet for a century, come back and be like, oh, that's little Jimmy Scott. His voice is just very much in a unique place. My children think it's a girl, you know, and I remember thinking that myself at first, you know, just a big burly black sister, but now I just hear this diminutive little man and know that it's him. And he's just got this wonderful way of sharing the details and grit of the story with you. He's got 2 or 3 records on Savoy from this era that are fantastic. I don't know who the backing band is, sadly, but he disappears off the scene for the longest of times, in part because Herman Lubinsky doesn't want to record him anymore, but still has him under contract. So he's kind of stuck, and he actually records a record for this label called Tangerine, I think in 59, 60, 61, in there somewhere. And Lubinsky sues him, and sues Tangerine Records, and it's not allowed to come out for the longest of times. That's just how Herman Lubinsky operates. Dollars and cents all the time, every day. I think eventually that record did come out, and I don't remember exactly how it all played out, but to be honest, but little Jimmy Scott records aren't that expensive when you find them. At least they weren't when I was buying them. They're probably still in the $40 to $60 range, maybe $100 for a really nice one, but it's still under the surface enough that there's just not enough demand for people looking for Jimmy Scott records to make them super expensive. So the next one on my list here is number 31. And this was a pretty tough record to come by. Ah, shit. Her name is Laverne Smith. To get a little bit glare, I'm going to show you the actual album cover. And the New Orleans Nightingale, they call her. And you can tell the sister's got a little bit of soul going on. It's that's very bluesy right there. You know, that's very bluesy. And she's got a bit of Bessie Smith, Mom's Mabley, but you still got she's not that easy to compare. She's not Nina, she's not Sarah, she's not Billy, she's not Ella. She's kind of a bluesy jazz singer that you've never heard of, on Savoy from 1956. And it's just one of those records, if you stumble on this in a store. And here's another secret. When you're in stores, sometimes just go through the random alphabetical sections in the jazz section, because there's going to be stuff in there that the average jazz collector's not looking for. They're going to be looking under Miles, under Coltrane, under Curtis Fuller, under Herbie Hancock. They're not going to look in the random sections. And often you can just flip through those sections and you'll find a couple of old Savoys in there somewhere, depending on where you are, especially more on the East Coast, that no one's looking for. And they might be under $20 if you get lucky. You know, pretty much when I go into record stores now, one thing I do is search the random letters of the alphabet, because most of the discographies of the big artists, I have everything I want or that I'm looking for anyway. An exception would be, you know, if a new tone poet came out by someone, I'll go look at that section. But it's not that often nowadays where I'm actually digging through an artist's real area. It's those random sections where you just go through there. You're like, oh, there's an old Verve. What's this? Oh, a couple old Argo. Cool. And you just sift through the sand looking for nuggets. And I've told you guys before, it's beautiful. I've told you guys before that anything on these great jazz labels, it's all going to be great. They didn't record bad musicians back in the 50s. Studio time was just too valuable. This is a wonderful record. Deep in a Dream by a little Italian fellow by the name of Al Caiola. And he ends up on the United Artists label. doing poppy jazz guitar remix records of Broadway shows and movie themes, and he makes a ton of records at United Artists, probably close to 20. And I have a couple of those, but not many. But his two early records he does at Savoy are beautiful, elegant jazz guitar. A wonderful, soft, brushy player with a nice tone. Bernie Priven, Hank Jones on the piano, Kenny Clark is on the drums, and Clyde Lombardi. It's got the cool guitar-shaped text right there. And I've told you guys before, but everything on Savoy up to about 12,060 should have a black and white cover if it's a first pressing. And a lot of Savoys did get reissues with new color covers, but the same numbers. And so it's fairly easy to end up with the same Savoy record because you didn't recognize the cover. Dizzy Gillespie, Lester Young, a lot of those records, they have multiple covers. And it can be very, like, oh, I don't have this, I don't recognize this. And you come on with the same Ernie Wilkins record. And sometimes if the price is right and the cover's cool, you're okay with it, but it's still not ideal. But beautiful playing, and there's Hank Jones. And I've said 1,000 times, if you got Hank Jones on a record, it's going to be serious. Hank Jones doesn't do sessions that are garbage. Hank Jones, by virtue of him being there, will make sure the session is not garbage. And Caiola is a player I wouldn't jump at those United Artists records. They're under $5, they're fun, light entertainment. But these early two Savoys, there's another one right after this, couple, maybe 40 or 20 records later, in the 40s or 50s in the sequence. That's also fantastic, but just love this one here. And again, you got Hank Jones tinkling and winkling in the background, and that seals the deal for me. Yeah, see what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm saying? Now, this one was a confusing thing for me. And I'll be honest, I thought I had this record long before I had this record. And you might say, oh, how's that? And there's two records in that series, but they don't really mark them as number one and number two. And the entry on Wikipedia actually has 12045 listed as the Mingus Cirillo compilation. And so I thought I had this one for the longest time when I actually had this one, which is 12059. And so when 12059 kept coming up missing, I'm like, what's going on? Why don't I have that? I do have that. And I eventually figured out that there's two records with, similar covers, Jazz Composers Workshop, and 12045, which on my book said it was the Mingus one, was not the Mingus one, it was the first one. And it's got Bill Russo, Shorty Rogers, Shelly Manne, and Jimmy Joffrey. So some up-and-coming West Coast brilliance, to be honest. Shelly Manne's a real leader of the West Coast scene. Jimmy Joffrey's one of the great composers and arrangers of the West Coast sound, and brings West Coast cool into a much broader composed hints of the avant-garde even at times. And that comes a little bit later, but Joffrey's ahead of the curve in a lot of ways. His patterns in space, some of his early records, even on Capitol, he's a very interesting player who made a mark early on as a composer. He was highly in demand. Shorty Rogers, of course, is a legend, and a lot of his records are classics. And I think he played with Woody Herman as well. Bill Russo's also a great player. And it took me a long time to track this one down. And the good news is, this one, which is outstanding, is actually the cheaper of the two because there's no Mingus on it. Roy Savage Jr. bought this, looks back in 1950-something. There's two different sessions here by the looks of it. Art Pepper's on some of the tracks, Bob Cooper's on some of the tracks, Bob Gordon, Conte Condoli. So some really great talent shows up here in these tracks that were recorded 2 different sessions for Savoy, probably 54, 55, and then they were coupled together on this album. And I'm going to cover the next one since we're here. And that's the Jazz Composer Workshop, and again with Mingus. Again, the great Savoy red label. Interesting. On the record itself, it says it's Composer's Workshop number 2, but it does not say that on the jacket anymore. So that's the second one. And Wally Cirillo gets the leadership on the second side of this record. Yeah. Mingus is already diving into some of the out aspects as early as 56 here. And of course, he's doing stuff at Pithecanthropus Atlantic already that's very much in this vein. John Laporta shows up on this. Mingus, Laporta, Teo Macero, George Barrows on the tenor, baritone, Mal Waldron's on the piano, and Rudy Nichols on the drums. And on side 2 was Wally Cirillo, Teo Macero, Charlie Mingus, and Kenny Clark. And so Mingus and Macero are on both sides. It's cool. But interesting, forward-thinking Savoy stuff that's interesting parts of Mingus's development. You know, this shows you as these were recorded 54, 55, came out in 56, and so these were led into Pithecanthropus. This is that bridge, and again you have the lovely laminated cover. Some of Savoy's better art actually is on these 2 records. Savoy has a lot of really bad covers, as I've said many times. Another record that's really fantastic by a player that's fantastic is by a guy by the name of Phil Urso. He's a great player on the saxophone. And I have a Japanese reissue of this, but I also have an old one. And the old one's a little beat up, to be honest, but I got it for a real cheap price. So it's always nice to have the old one and just play the new one. But Bob Brookemeyer's on this with Horace Silver, Kenny Clark and Percy Heath. And then the second side has Walter Bishop Jr., Clyde Lombardi, Sid Bulkin with Phil Urso. But Phil plays that tenor with a lot of bravado and fury. The trombone there, Brookemeyer's fantastic. But this is number 12056. And Savoy's starting to get into more and more original recordings that are contemporary in the moment. So much of what's before this is stuff that's that back catalog coming out on LP. But they're starting to do some really great sessions like this. And the session cooks. You know, you got Horace Silver as a young man. You have Bobby Brookemeyer, who's one of the great trombone players that was a really innovative player in his own right. Percy Heath and Kenny Clark. There's some royalty on these records. And Savoy does, as it were, slip through the cracks. It just doesn't have the reissue following the people who are knowledgeable about it. In fact, on a whim last night, I Googled Savoy records on YouTube, and a lot of what came up with stuff I posted and done on Savoy. There's plenty of Savoy records, songs on YouTube, but there's not a lot of information or history and background of the label. I found more on the gospel era than honestly, which I found strange, because when you look at Savoy and you just Google Wikipedia, or even I think it maybe even just Google it, and they show you the artist and that string of photographs that you can kind of scroll through. It's really a who's who. It's an incredible roster that come through the ranks of Savoy Records from the late 40s into the early to mid 60s. They really have, and they don't have a lot of the landmark albums, in part because a lot of stuff is patched together from different sessions. The covers aren't eye-catching and legendary. Most of it has these guys as they're transcending to bigger things. So there's not a lot of these records that are like in the top 200 jazz records of all time. There's not a lot of Savoy stuff in there. in part because of ignorance, but in part because Lubinsky's interference. But there's still a ton of very important ladders and steps towards where these artists were heading and going. And I find it's a really undervalued and underappreciated body of work. Just the fact it's been reissued so infrequently. You know, there's no OJCs, there's no modern reissue group. The Japanese are pretty much it. They bought the Savoy, and I think it was Toshiba, if I remember right. Savoys have been reissued in Japan, quite a few of them. But that's really your only other option, aside from Savoy themselves, who reissued on the Oxblood label in the 60s and 70s, a lot of their own titles. But it's a undervalued, underserviced. Sadly, not enough people have information and knowledge. That's not to say there's not a ton of interesting tidbits out there about Savoy. For example, there's a lot of little tidbits about how awful a guy Lubinsky was. And I read this one quote yesterday that was true and honest in what it said, that in spite of his reputation, in spite of how awful he was instrumental in getting a lot of young black talent off the streets of Newark and eventually launched them into great things. And so he obviously was driven by the money. There was no nobility in his endeavors, but he saw talent when he saw it, and he was a keen scout. He could recognize that, yeah, you have a little bit of that. I've featured this record once or twice lately. I think it was in the Throw Grabbers and the City at Night, I think, as well. But this is the Marlene record, Marlene Ver Plank, and it's just outstanding. And a lot of what makes it outstanding is the fact that Joe Wilder is just fantastic on this. And did I have to look it up? I thought it's listed the whole band here. Wendell Marshall, Kenny Clark, Joe Wilder, Herbie Mann, Hank Jones. So you got that rhythm section of Jones, Marshall, and Clark, which backed a lot of great Savoy records, with Herbie Mann and Joe Wilder adding some horn elements. And Mann's gonna have that soft flout that just tickles your eardrums. And Wilder is just playing one of the most saccharine, lovely, rich, satisfying tones I've ever heard. You know, and every time he comes in on this record, my hair stands on end. He's just such a great player. And again, another guy that just slips under the radar is Joe Wilder, whose record I'm going to feature here. But this one took me a long time to find. And you can see it's taped up. It looks like it might have been a KJIM library radio station, FM 59. It's a beat up, but the vinyl's pristine. And I had low expectations for it, but when I saw who the band was, I'm like, yeah, that's got to be worth having. Hank Jones, Joe Wilder, and it's so surpassed my hopes for it. It's just bliss on a vinyl LP. The very next record is Joe Wilder's Joe Wilder. And I featured this not that long ago. People commented on it. I've got the Lee Morgan Volume 3 cover. 12063. Puts it in about 1956. And I just love holding old Savoys in my hand. They feel more like vintage, deep dive collectible pieces to me than a lot of the other labels do. And as much as I love Blue Note and Prestige and Riverside, there's something more anonymous, more thrilling about finding an old Savoy because you haven't seen it 1,000 times. And it's always great to stumble on an old Blue Note or an old Prestige. But it's not like you haven't seen that Kenny Dorham record 100 times in 100 different pressings. You know, most of the time when you stumble on an old Savoy, you haven't seen it before. And it only gets more and more obscure. Some of these guys you've at least heard of. There's a lot of things you've never heard of, and you're just like, oh. And like I said, I'll say it again, take a chance. There's not really bad jazz records on these labels. There's anonymous, there's stuff that fits in different veins, but the ability and the talent is always there. These guys did not waste tape on people who could not play. This is the Bowen Singin' Slam Stewart. He was a great bass player, a bit in the boogie woogie side of jazz, but he played with a lot of the greats in the 40s, into the 50s. He was kind of known for actually singing along with his playing to create chords. That's his voice creating a chord. And he heard someone do it on the violin. I can't remember who. And he got the idea there. But when you say Bowen Singin' Slam, that's what he's doing. He's creating an interval that creates a chord with his voice over top of what he's playing on the bass. And he bowed his bass a lot as well. So he's actually a very unique player. Errol Garner's on this. We actually played with some in the 40s. Harold Wess, Johnny Garnieri, Sammy Weiss. It's fun. It's very Afrocentric, black. It's very, it just feels like the African American story. You know, it has very little attempt to not be incredibly rich in the tapestry and color that it's providing you. It's a pretty tough record to find, and he doesn't have a lot of records as a leader, but he was certainly on a lot of great sessions over the years and a fairly in-demand player. Yet he's one of the great bass players that you kind of forget about. He's fairly forgotten, and Lubinsky gave him that great session from this era. One of my favorite album covers ever, and I can't believe I'm saying that about a Savoy record, is this fantastic Milt Jackson. I think it's called Milt Skyline, just the jazz skyline. And it's, of course, got lower tip of Manhattan down there, lit up at night, which you could have seen a lot of that from the Jersey side. You know, you probably couldn't have seen it from Newark unless you were up at one of the towers in Newark. Because Newark does have a couple pretty cool Art Deco skyscrapers. I find Newark a fascinating little part of the jazz story, largely because of Savoy, but being one of those satellites of New York City and having a large black population, it was almost like a second Harlem. You know, Harlem was Brooklyn, but Newark was another place where the blacks were herded into. And I don't know if you're ever familiar with redlining, but they had ways of moving minorities into certain neighborhoods, in part in an effort to blight those areas so that the banks could repossess those properties eventually at a bargain basement price and redevelop them. If that's not an aspect of slavery and oppression, we're going to herd you all into some little area, not send any police in there or services in there, so that the area becomes completely blighted and run down. And then as the crime goes up, we're going to evict all of you, tear it all down and develop it, and have to pay next to nothing to do it, which will triple our profits when we redevelop it into a new part of the city. And even New York, supposedly liberal New York, it's a staple of what happened with the redlining in those areas. Milt, of course, was a very important part of the modern jazz quartet with John Lewis and company. but he makes a lot of records as a solo artist, as a leader. And outside of the boundaries of the modern MJQ, he's a very blues-driven, dynamic player who's super fun. And of all the guys in jazz, Milt Jackson would be one of the guys I most would like to spend time with. I bet you would have been a blast. He just seems like a personality, a character. The fantastic Lucky Thompson's on this, which is another reason why I'm a huge fan of this record. And then the rhythm section. Hank Jones, Wendell Marshall, and Kenny Clark. Again, just a great album cover. Really captures, in still a dated way, it looks like, you know, as 1950s as it can be. It's funny, you look at those modern Blue Note covers from the same era, and you can't really pinpoint when that's from. You look at this and instantly you're like, okay, that's 1957, 1955. Like the typography, the printing quality, the colors, how it was all done. It's all very revealing. Another guy who I'm a big fan of, who is less obvious, is a guy that played with Basie for a long time, Frank Wess. And Frank Wess is a fantastic horn player. He plays the flute, he plays the saxophone. He swings, and he swings hard, and he's as rooted in the blues as any guy who ever played in the Basie group. And those Basie groups in the 50s and 60s are just so filled with great talent. It's really insane. And it's amazing how many of the great Basie band members matriculate into the great jazz labels of the 50s and 60s. This has Frank Foster, Basie alumni, Benny Powell, Henry Coker, Kenny Burrell, Eddie Jones, and Kenny Clark. And I know at least 1, 2, 3, 4 of those guys played with Basie a long time, maybe 5 even. North, South, East, West, and Kenny Burrell. I don't think he was a Basie alumni that I know of, because I have such a big section of Kenny Burrell and Count Basie. But again, the album covers start getting better here. We're number 12072, and that's actually a pretty good album cover. And yet, the black and white photo, everything about it still has a vintage look. It just looks like a little more thought and effort went into it than a lot of what was happening the year before at Savoy, where the covers look very thrown together. Another record by a bass player who is not very well known. It's amazing how many of these old Savoys actually are promo copies. And this one here has a promo stamp on it. That one has a promo stamp on the label. I'll show you the other side. Those stamps, if you can see that, it indicates the promo pressings. And all old Savoys are promo pressings, which A is cool because it tells you that you're getting the oldest pressing you can get. But it's also telling you that the runs that a lot of these records made were pretty small. And I've read that 2,000, 5,000 pressings was probably in the range where most of these records made a run or two of maybe 2,000, 4,000, 5,000 copies. And something like Blue Note, where they've been reissued all the time, it saturates the market where we kind of lose sight of how rare the originals are. And especially the first pressings. And with a label like Savoy, so many of these records have never been reissued past that first time. So that means your chance of getting a promo is pretty good. Because they only made 1,500 copies of it, and they probably sent out 300 as promos around the country to all the record stations and record stores, radio stations. This is composed of 2 different sessions. This is possibly my favorite Savoy album cover, and I would have had this sooner had I known who the fuck Mort Herbert was. And I'm not sure if it's Mort Herbert or Mort Herbert, how it's said. I'm guessing it's Herbert, but he's a bass player, studio guy, played in a lot of live groups over the years, and he doesn't get a lot of publicity, and it's probably his only record as a leader that I know of. But listen to who's on these 2 sessions. Session number 1 has Ronnie Ball, a great pianist, Mort Herbert on the bass, Don Stratton on the trumpet, Sahib Shihab on the baritone, Mike Cuozzo on the tenor, and Kenny Clark. And then the second session has Joe Wilder, Bobby Jasper, Sahib Shihab, Dick Katz, and Kenny Clark. So both of them are great little sessions with great little groups of that second tier jazz star. You know, Katz, Shihab, Jasper, Wilder, Cuozzo, Ball. These are all names that pretty big jazz fans will know. The beginners are not going to know those guys, but those are all pretty big names once you get into the music. But 2 great sessions. Wow, for a complete discography. I just love. Again, Ozzy Cadena helped produce and arrange almost all these sessions, and Rudy Van Gelder was the engineer behind so much of the body of Savoy's work in 56, 55, 57, 58. Van Gelder really put the work in. And something I've discussed before briefly, there's Joe Wilder, was Van Gelder so in demand purely because he was the best or the greatest? Or has that been a little bit manipulated by how we see, because he's recorded so many of the best and the greatest? And I have a sneaking suspicion that the reason why Prestige and Blue Note and Savoy, plus other labels, were always using Van Gelder is because Van Gelder never turned away black musicians. And not to be a skeptic or whatever, but there's plenty of stories of black musicians showing up and not being allowed entry. And I'm guessing to avoid the hassle and the degrading feeling and the complications and probably the expense as well. If you're going to record at Columbia Studios in New York or any of those great studios in Manhattan, they weren't going to be cheap. So I'm sure Van Gelder was less expensive, but he was also completely willing to book his time, with the majority of his artists being African American, and didn't have a problem with that at any point. And so I think by virtue of default, he got so many of these great sessions out of convenience and logistics as much as it was because he was innovative and great. And I think some of that's been written in posterity and applied to him. And it's not saying he wasn't great. He's a fantastic engineer, but it seems like he had his own studio. He was willing to record blacks. And as a DJ who's worked in the black community, I know how even still today, they'll book their events in places where they know they're not going to get hassled. Because it's easy to get hassled when you gather some black folks together. Real easy. And Van Gelder's studio was a hassle-free zone. And so I think a lot of them went there for that reason. And in posterity, we've looked back and go, God, Van Gelder, he must have been the best. And it's probably not really what was driving it. But still, kudos to him. Tip your hat to Van Gelder for never turning away a black musician. That's an incredible achievement and accomplishment. And you facilitated the legacy of so many giants in this music, Rudy. And boy, we all owe you a great debt. So I don't want to in any way diminish your incredible career. It's just I think it's been a bit by default because the other studios were so much more racist. This is the great jazz guitarist Chuck Wayne featuring Zoot Sims and the fantastic Brewmore. This is number 12,077. A pretty tough record to come by, I'm not gonna lie. I was thrilled when I finally tracked one down probably about a year ago. I like the album cover, even though again it's very dated. He has a very interesting kind of career that touches on a lot of different elements. It's a bit like Hank Garland, where it's almost country jazz in his tone at times. Ed Shaughnessy, George Duvivier, Harvey Leonard, Blue Brewmore, and Zoot Sims. I'm just a huge fan of jazz guitar. You know, Al Caiola, Joe Puma, Kenny Burrell, Grant Green, Wes Montgomery, Chuck Wayne. I love jazz guitar. I think it's very sprightly and invigorating, and it doesn't really bash the listener over the head at any point. You know, it's very easy to DJ it and play it and feel loungy and inviting to people. And it doesn't have those brights that are going to cut into conversation and make it hard to hear each other. You know, you start playing a lot of trumpets in a DJ setting where people are trying to talk. They're going to be asking the managers, "Can you turn that guy down?" You know, so you want to keep your lows and your mids even reduced, and allow the groove and the bass kind of to carry it, and allow those mids and highs to stay soft. A fantastic vibe player. I had this one at the last second, and Tal Farrell's another great guitar player as well, who made a lot of stuff at Verve, and Charlie Mingus plays the bass on this. But Red Norvo, big red hair, goatee, he's a great player. We know him mostly for the West Coast, but he makes his record on Savoy 12088, and I believe it's from one session at this point. It's amazing how many of these Savoy sessions are from multiple dates with different rhythm sections. But yeah, it appears as just a trio the whole session. Savoy Records, Rudy Van Gelder, Ozzy Cadena. And as I mentioned on part one of this, by this point, they've kind of banished Lubinsky from being around the musicians as much as possible. Sign their checks and just stay away from them. You know, you don't show them the respect that they earned. And it's sad, you know. And Lubinsky, being a Jew himself, obviously had seen plenty of oppression. So, did he have his good days and his good moments? Yeah, we all do. We all have a duality inside of us. No one's a good person all the time. No one's a bad person all the time. Once in a while Hitler did a good thing, and once in a while Gandhi fucked up. You know, we all have that duality inside of us of good and evil. And we can't really reform good and evil in the world. All we can really do is choose what we are going to be. And I think it's a waste of time trying to convert the world to goodness. Because circumstances and environment will often dictate whether someone's good or bad. And often even perspective will determine whether someone's good or bad. What you might think of me as doing is a bad thing, for me and my family's perspective, it might be a good thing. So it's not really our place to judge good and evil in other people. It's kind of inherent on us to recognize that good and evil will both always exist, and exist within me. And I must choose every day to try to do the right thing as often as possible. No one does the right thing all the time. It's just not possible. Even Herman Lubinsky must have had his days where he was fun to be around. And he was joking with his black musicians. But for the most part, he seemed like a pretty intense, unpleasant guy to be around. And from every post I've seen, everything I've seen written about him, that seems to be the prevailing weather pattern in the Herman Lubinsky universe. The last record I want to show you, and this actually makes 15, I believe. I didn't mean to make it 15. It's supposed to be 12. But it's just one of those things where I'm like, oh, I gotta show that too, you know? And I have almost 200 Savoys. So there's a lot of stuff I didn't pull that I love. A lot. There really is. And when I scrolled through I could very easily do another session here of a dozen Savoys that no one's ever heard of or seen. But that's true for most of this list. You know, that first list, most people are going to know most of those artists at least. The second list, half these people you've never heard of. And I could do a third list easy with 12 records that no one's ever heard of the guy. But I guess let me know in your feedback if you want to see that. If not, we'll move on to a different label. But this is Nika's Tempo by the great Gigi Gryce, a guy who was very underappreciated in the time and ends up walking away from jazz by, I think, early 60s. He's moved on. And he didn't really have much impact at the time. He makes a couple great records with Donald Byrd, but even those records aren't super expensive, shockingly. You can get that one in Riverside for $40. The Columbia stuff's not that expensive. So it's a great intro into Gigi Gryce. but his 3 or 4 records on New Jazz are some of the rarest records in the Prestige catalog, and you'll really only find them in Japan nowadays, and they'll cost you, even for the Japanese pressings, 60, 70, 80 bucks. They're just hard records to come by. This is Nika's Tempo on Savoy, number 12137. But this is stuff from the vaults. It wasn't recorded here in 57. It's recorded probably 54. And that's even a guess. But there's 2 different sessions here. One session it's Gryce, Monk, Percy Heath, and Art Blakey. And I'd put that even earlier. I'd put that Gryce, Monk, Heath, and Blakey. That sounds like it could be 1950, 51. Gryce to be the wild card in that, But by 55, those guys, Monk and Blakey, are all doing their own thing. And it's still possible, I guess. But in the first session there is the orchestra, the bigger group. And it's got Gryce, Farmer, Eddie Burt, Jimmy Cleveland, Danny Banks, Cecil Payne, Gunther Schuller, Julius Watkins, Bill Barber, Horace Silver, Oscar Pettiford, Art Blakey, Kenny Clark, and Ernestine Anderson, believe it or not, on a couple tracks. So I'm guessing that's probably early 50s as well. You know what? I'm actually going to look that up real quick. So let's take a quick little look at it, and both sessions are from 55. And the first session, they're both recorded for a different label, Signal Records. And Savoy eventually bought that out and reissued the stuff in 58, 59, 60 when this comes out, 12137. But and the second side with the Monk, Heath, and Blakey, 3 of the songs are Monk originals. And I guess Riverside wasn't thrilled that in 55 he's putting out original compositions on a different label. But he was, as the Simons, there was really nothing they could do. And it wasn't until the next year when he's putting out Brilliant Corners at Riverside. Because if you remember, Monk's first recordings at Riverside were Ellington songs. So the only really original compositions by Monk in 55, from what I just read, were on this Gigi Gryce side 2 of this session. It's an interesting session. Gryce is a great player. He's one of those guys that you really don't hear enough about. Not enough people know much about Gigi Gryce. And he's you could tell he's a complicated person. And he had a lot of issues with his own self-dynamics that are kind of revealed in his playing, but they're also kind of revealed in his departure, So, dig into Gigi Gryce. Let me know if you'd be interested in seeing 12 really unheard of Savoys. If not, we'll just kind of move on to the next label. But y'all be safe, stay warm, stay isolated for now. Hopefully we'll all be able to congregate again together soon. Let's get through this winter, and I'll check with you guys next week. Y'all be safe. Peace.